Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. It's the usual suspects here. I'm Mr. O'Hagan and I'm here with Mr. Zagari.
How we doing, folks? Sorry for the Bruce Springsteen-esque voice today.
Today on the Underground, 1860 to 1900, a time of ations and isms. Okay, I'm sure our title got you to stop and say, what? So let's clear up this title before we go any further along. Zags, could you explain to our listeners why we went with this unusual title?
Sure, Mr. O. Studying this time period focuses us to juggle a lot of different developments and influences on society, economics, politics, and culture. The more we speak about the subject of this podcast, the more we realize that it was all about, right, the ations and the isms. So, for example, we have industrialization is one of the most consequential developments of the second half of the 19th century. It represents the foundation of modern capitalism, but it also spurred quite a lot of anti immigrant sentiment, what we know as nativism, as workers from different parts of the globe flooded into the United States.
Yeah, certainly the Irish experienced that animosity almost
For sure.
immediately, right? I mean, WASP America is suspicious of the Irish Catholics and for that matter, other Catholics who come in later.
Right. The Irish need not apply always. That sign always,
Right,
triggers for
right.
me. But true, and the animosity and suspicion doesn't stop them from coming to America. And those immigrants cause American cities like New York, Boston, Philly, Pittsburgh, and Chicago to grow at a phenomenal rate. It converts America from a rural to a more urban. That is urbanization, my friends. And guess what? Hamilton wins.
Yep.
He always envisioned an America as more of a cosmopolitan country, not a nation of those yeoman farmers.
Yeah, Jefferson, how's your agrarian utopia working now?
Yeah. I mean, we could see this time period as the birth, basically, of modern America, but we also have to see it as the passing of Jefferson's vision for the nation.
Exactly. These Asians and isms permeate the time period. They overlap, one causes the other. I think they're a great framework to understand the time period. So let's work on the Asians first.
Sure, let's start off with industrialization. Perhaps no development is as important. Evaluate the relative importance there
Ooh,
as the growth of industry. I would argue that all other Asians and isms are kind of a byproduct of this circumstance. America's economy is remade in this era. The market revolution was a starting point, but the post Civil War, the entire process accelerates, and nothing accelerates like the railroad. Get it?
yeah, dad joke.
Big dad joke
Yep.
right there. All
Okay.
right. It's the first major industry, and it spurs all the others: lumber, iron, coal, and finally, that's right, oil and steel. Our industrial economy is born in this 1865 through 1900 era. So, what do you think? What's the next Asian?
I think we have to look at immigration, right? Industrialization creates opportunity, and workers are needed. First, the Transcontinental Railroad, which attracts Irish and some Germans and the Chinese out west. But it's the Eastern factories like Carnegie
Yeah.
Steel Mill in Pittsburgh, starting in the 1860s and 1870s, that draw Southern and Eastern Europeans. Italians, Poles, Czechs, Russians, Jews. They come in large numbers and they gather together in particular industries. Poles in the steel mills, for
Mhm.
example, and particular locations. And that takes us to the next Asian, which
For-
is what, Zags?
So that's going to be urbanization. Anytime we discuss urbanization, I always think The Godfather too. But factories are built near or in small towns, and workers come to work there. Those factories become the hub of life. More people arrive, and those towns then grow into cities. Small cities eventually grow into large cities, and we can see a shift from America's rural identity. This is that shift we're talking about between Jefferson and Hamilton. It will take some time, but by 1920, America will see more people living in cities than in rural areas. And let's remember the conditions in those cities. They were often disgusting, unhealthy, overcrowded, and very unsafe. Nobody shone a light on those conditions as brightly as journalist Jacob Riis in his photo essay, How the Other Half Lives. And, in reality, he does that as well because he's using flash photography, one of the new technological advancements of the time period for the camera.
Industrialization, right? There you go.
Absolutely. So, Mr. O, any other Asians we should highlight here?
Well, let's address two ideas that, interestingly enough, seem to be pulling in different directions: assimilation or Americanization and segregation.
Mm,
On one hand, immigrants and Native Americans are under significant pressure to join American society. They're expected to abandon their cultures and accept the predominant American culture, including language and reverence for democratic and capitalist institutions. If you don't want that, you're considered dangerous or even suspicious.
huh. Guess we'll hit that in the 1950s again as
Yes,
well.
we will.
So, but I digress. But, when you're saying this, I'm thinking of the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, where American Indians were basically shipped and forced to learn English, dressed in American style clothing, and had their hair cut. What an awful experience for those people. They even were forced to play in American style orchestras and bands and play Americana musical pieces just to further their Americanism. From doing a little digging, I found a commencement program from the Carlisle School graduation from 1897. The choir actually performed a number called March to Victory. I assume we can take that as victory in the sense of Americanization, clearly not in the preservation of their culture.
It's absolutely the case. And at the same time, in both the North and South, the African American experience is of segregation. They're purposely being excluded from American society. It's so ironic, isn't it? I mean, those who want to be equal,
Mhm.
participating members, like African Americans, who have a long history here, are being told no, while those who'd like to hold on to their traditions, like immigrants, like Native Americans, they're under extreme
Yeah.
pressure to assimilate.
You know, your mention of the word excluding made me think about the Chinese. Like African Americans, they sought a seat at the American table, but suffered terrible discrimination. Federal legislation limiting their admission into the country, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, was legislation that was the first piece that targeted this specific group. But what do we say? We shift our discussion now to these isms.
All right, so our first ism. Well, if this period is about modern America, that's in large part because it's about modern business and modern capitalism.
Right.
Capitalism as we experience today: big business, national corporations, corporate management, boards, controlling interests, controlling shares. Those terms apply to 1874 as much as they apply to 2024. And the celebration of wealthy industrialists, well, money equals power. And these men have money to spare. So capitalism, I think, is at the top of the list.
For sure. And let's throw in there another ism, one that was used to justify this extreme capitalism, and that's going to be social Darwinism. Just as Darwin had explained in the natural world through evolution and survival of the fittest, theorists like Herbert Spencer applied those standards to the man made world. Of course, a lion eats a gazelle. That's evolution. Well, of course, Carnegie has a net worth of 500 million and some factory workers struggling to feed his family despite working an 80-hour week. Carnegie is better suited for the environment.
Interestingly, Carnegie went even further to justify these conditions. He wrote The Gospel of Wealth, in which he
Right.
defended his outrageous fortune and this outrageous wealth disparity by saying it was necessary for society to advance. He and other industrialists were entrusted with these fortunes so they could safeguard them to give them back to society in meaningful ways. They didn't trust the average worker to have the money and put it to good use. Listen to this quote from his book: "The man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. Such, in my opinion, is the true gospel concerning wealth, obedience to which is destined some day to solve the problem of the rich and the poor, and to bring peace on earth among men goodwill." Carnegie would actually use his wealth for public works like universities, Carnegie Mellon,
Yep.
the arts, Carnegie Hall, Carnegie, of course, and especially libraries, which were Carnegie's greatest love. He saw the freedom of self education through libraries as the greatest gift that any society could offer its people. But, what we see here is a justification
Sure.
that is, going to be used to explain away his enormous wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a real top down. I know best approach reminds me of another ism, and this top down idea is really paternalism.
Yeah, and it's in a really extreme kind of paternalism, isn't it? That we're gonna dominate all of society, and we're gonna tell you what society is gonna look like. But we're the only ones capable of making those decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, we mentioned it before, but let's remind the listeners that nativism was alive and well during the era. Immigrants were so vital to the growth of America, but they were hardly welcomed with open arms. We mentioned the Irish and the Chinese already, but Italians, Eastern Europeans, Jews, they were all victims of nativism. It reminds me of old St. Pat's Church dating back to the 1850s in New York City, where they're building walls around it because people were attacking Catholics.
Yeah. Well, we should focus on a couple of isms that sought to respond to all of these developments too. So let's start with populism, which we've talked about in the previous chapter. It grew in the West, and it's really designed to push back against big businesses,
Mhm.
especially railroads and banks. But they also became very active in politics, trying to reclaim some of the power that they thought had been stolen by these wealthy industrialists.
Sure, seeing the gross economic inequality in America had rampant abuses of workers, which then leads to unionism or the organization of labor in that era as well. When you have no power, you organize. It's the only way to combat the super rich. Use your numbers to challenge their power. You got to take the power back, so to speak, because otherwise, these workers that are being exploited, they don't have a chance for any type of advancement in their working conditions or their, what we'll talk about later, their bread and butter unionism.
And obviously, capitalism is also getting a bad name. So we see the rise of socialism as a political force.
Yep.
Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was, in fact, not simply an expose of the meatpacking industry, but it was a condemnation of capitalism in general. Eugene Debs, who was the president of the American Railway Workers Union and a devoted socialist, he'd run for the presidency multiple times in the early 1900s and received almost a million votes
Huh.
in 1912. So definitely showing you some signs of societal pushback against this capitalism. He said this about capitalism and its biggest proponents. Socialism is very properly recognized by the capitalist class as the one cloud upon the horizon which portends an end to the system in which they have waxed fat, insolent and despotic through the exploitation of their countless wage working slaves. That's a pretty harsh statement, basically saying these capitalists are worried because they know we socialists have the answer to what they've been doing. So
Sure.
some of these isms created reactionary isms. Capitalism helps to create and sponsor, foster this really strong sense of socialism in the country.
With talking about this entire podcast that we've been discussing, these Asians and isms, it reminds me of episode one of Ken Burns' Baseball.
Ken Burns, here we
Yeah, all right,
go.
all right. I know. Just bear with me for a second here, folks. There's a section in episode one entitled The Baseball Messiah. And as we all know, baseball is America's pastime. It reads as follows. In 1882, owners of big city clubs left out of the National League established a league of their own, the American Baseball. This is two words now, not a single word. Baseball Association. Its games cost just a quarter. Its team played on Sundays, and its ballpark sold liquor. The new quote beer and whiskey league draws bigger crowds. Its stands were filled with immigrants and working men, not the mostly middle class, native born fans whose first love remained in the National League. So these new leagues are reflecting the changing of America. They're reflecting nativism, they're reflecting immigration. But baseball in a whole is also reflecting unionism and segregation of the era. Later on in that same episode, there's a section called My Skin is Against Me. Listen to this one. The battle between capital and labor was reflected in baseball. This is referring to the early labor disputes between team owners and players, no different than workers in one of Carnegie's steel mills. So was the troubling struggle over race. Black Americans freed from slavery by the Civil War and filled with hope for a better future soon found themselves prisoners, again, of Jim Crow laws in the South that segregated every aspect of their life and white prejudice in the North as well. I find this fascinating that they bring up this idea of de facto segregation intertwined in the sport of baseball, yet reflecting on the larger aspect of the American identity of this time period.
That definitely shows how pervasive these isms are in the time period. And when we get to the next unit, we're going to see how this set of ations and isms spurs the development of others like imperialism and progressivism. But that's a story for another podcast. We'll get to that one
So
next.
you're saying part two?
Part two of this is
The
coming.
sequel.
Well, guys, that's all for today. Be sure to use this YouTube channel for its content spotlights, unit reviews, 8 Push on the Road segments, and other spectacular podcasts. Well, we hope to see you next time on the U.S. History Underground.